Good evening, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies Asia, located here in Singapore. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this IISS Fullerton Lecture in the Straits Room of the Fullerton Hotel. We have with us this evening approaching 200 guests from Singapore's business, media, governmental, diplomatic, educational, and intellectual communities. Welcome, everyone. This evening's is the second lecture in the IISS Fullerton Lecture Series for 2013. I'm delighted that it will be delivered by Senator Bob Carr, Australia's Minister for Foreign Affairs. Given the significance of Canberra's relations with Singapore and the growing importance of its wider links with Southeast Asia, I think it's highly appropriate that we should hear from a key minister in the Australian government and that he should speak on the theme Southeast Asia at the crossroads of the Asian century. Senator Bob Carr has been in politics since the age of 15 when he joined his local branch of the Australian Labor Party. He was subsequently National President of Young Labour. After graduating in history from the University of New South Wales, he worked as a journalist for ABC Radio and later for the Bulletin magazine. He was elected to the New South Wales Legislative Assembly in 1983 and assumed a state ministerial post just over a year later. After the state government was defeated in the 1988 election, he became leader of the state opposition. He led Labour to victory in the 1995 state election, becoming as a result Premier of New South Wales. His government was re-elected by a large majority in 1999 and again in 2003. His time as Premier of New South Wales was marked by significant initiatives in education, environmental protection, police reform, and the encouragement of market forces through public-private partnerships. His government was also responsible for Sydney's hosting of the year 2000 Olympics, described by the International Olympic Committee as the best ever Olympic Games. Bob Carr resigned as state premier in 2005. He subsequently involved himself heavily in public debate, championing embryonic stem cell research and warning about the environmental consequences of continuing large-scale immigration. In March last year, then Prime Minister Julia Gillard announced that Bob Carr would be nominated to fill a vacancy in the Australian Senate and that he would become the new Minister for Foreign Affairs. Senator Carr took on his present role at a crucial time for Australia's relations with its region. Minister, we are truly honoured that you've agreed to speak in the IISS Fullerton Lecture Series this evening, and we look forward with real interest to hearing your address on the topic Southeast Asia at the crossroads of the Asian century. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Tim, thank you very much for that warm welcome. It's a great honour for me to be giving this lecture in Singapore. I remember being here on my first visit as Australian Foreign Minister in April last year. I chose Singapore for that first visit. And I remember an Australian businessman saying to me, our business community here feels as if Singapore is an extension of the Australian economy. And as we and as our Singaporean partners see it, Australia is an extension of the economy of Singapore. And that struck with me, true or half true. It stayed with me. And when we were discussing around the cabinet table in Canberra, the work on the Australia in the Asian Century white paper, I said, you need go no further than describe the relationship with Australia and Singapore. Look at that as a pointer or a template for what will happen in the relationship between Australia and other nations in Asia. And in the white paper, try to give a sense of inevitability about things that are underway and developing in any case. So the relationship with Singapore is important. I was struck as well at that meeting with Australian business people by the number of them, serious Australian firms basing themselves here to do business throughout the region. from a base here exploring business opportunities in the place I'm going to tomorrow, Myanmar, and elsewhere in Indochina. I think the relationship between Australia and Singapore reflects those economic links. It reflects the extraordinary people-to-people contacts we have. It reflects the candour that we've enjoyed over our history. My staff dragged out the story of Lee Kuan Yew hosting a dinner for Gough Whitlam, Australia's Prime Minister, 40 years ago, and Lee speaking approvingly of Australia's, quote, decisive break with the white Australia policy, unquote, of renewed engagement with Asia and Africa, and for recognition of Australia's Indigenous peoples. He said, quote, you've waved away the aura of racial superiority of the white peoples, a belief which the passage of time has made not only untenable, but unnecessarily offensive, unquote. And his sense, Lee Kuan Yew's sense on these strategic matters, unfailingly correct, was certainly right on this one, because Australia pre-1970s was insular, anxious, overwhelmingly European, committed to a white Australia policy, anxious about its neighbourhood, saddened by the decline of the British Empire, and economically protectionist. The Australia since the 70s has been globally engaged, focused on Asia, enmeshed in the forums of the region, self-consciously multicultural, confident of its place in the neighbourhood, and a free trader. I was asked, just being interviewed by the Straits Times about where we really stood in respect of Asia, and I said, it's not just the inevitability of geography, it's the inevitability of demography. 1.7 million Australians were born in Asia. That leaves, as a separate calculation, those with parents, one or two parents born in Asia. 1.7 million were born in Asia. As Premier of New South Wales, my happiest duty each year was to hand out the awards to the highest achievers in the end of school examinations. So from 1995 to 2005, once a year I'd hand out the certificates to proud youngsters with their parents popping photographs on the floor of the auditorium. I've got to say, the number of Chinese and Indian background and Indo-Chinese background grew markedly each year prior to their parents. The presence of proud parents from those backgrounds became more and more noticeable. Our greatest source of migrants, India and China. When we ran for the UN Security Council, we invited ambassadors from countries in Africa or the Middle East or the Caribbean to come to Australia and see Australia. These were people not from this region, so what they saw of Australia tended to take them by surprise, and the thing that was reported most often was that when they were in Brisbane or Sydney or Melbourne or Darwin, the Asian faces in the street told them that this was a different Australia from the Australia they expected. The fact that we were unabashedly multicultural was a factor in us securing 140 votes out of 193 in that General Assembly ballot. I've got to say, one of the things that makes us attractive to migrants from Asia is our European-derived institutions, the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, the fact that we are a secular nation that makes room for all religious beliefs, and our broad-based open investment economy, like that of Singapore, has merits that attract people to live there. Tim, I've got a very good speech, but a longish one, and I thought I might brutally abbreviate it so I can sit here and answer tough questions from you and the most abusive and contemptuous and derisory questions that you can come up with, because I'm used to working in the most robust parliamentary system in the world. Someone said to me once, so you've got question time, that must be like the House of Commons. I said it is a crude parody of the House of Commons that any member of the House of Commons would regard as a defamation. So used to question time not only in the Australian Senate, but in the New South Wales Legislative Assembly. I invite you to be as tough as you can, and I'll bring this speech to a fairly quick and summary conclusion. I saw a quote from Lee Kuan Yew in that little book that's come out, edited by Graham Allison. with his useful observations over the years, and there's a very good chapter on China, infused with the hyper-realism that is the Singaporean sensitivity. And he said, the world has an interest in a China that is outward-looking, engaged, educated about the world, and not a China that is xenophobic or insecure or jumpy about the world. And I think I've quoted it half a dozen times since. I think it's a very useful insight, and I subscribe to it. And I think it carries an obligation on us not to feed Chinese paranoia without compromising our national interests, and considering the choices that the current Chinese leadership post-March are going to be making. I think the evidence is relatively limited to this point, but the new leadership carries authority, is addressing the economic reform agenda, and just may, be committed to action on the rule of law and human rights that would meet some of the expectations of the world. Australia believes, and I know it's a cliche, we don't have to choose between our relationship with China, which is now conducted at the level of a strategic partnership, and our long-standing security relationship with the United States. On my first visit to Beijing, I was engaged in an exchange with the then Chinese foreign minister on this very subject. I said, we make an effort to understand Chinese history, Chinese foreign policy by reference to Chinese history. And certainly in China, it's not regarded as eccentric or uncommon to think about how China behaves towards the world in terms of things that were laid down during the Tang dynasty or earlier. I said to my Chinese interlocutor, Australia's behaviour in the world can be explained by its history as well. We are a small population, a large continent. And in 1905, when Japan defeated Russia, there are a lot of Australians who thought we must engage the United States more deeply in our region. The Australian Prime Minister at the time, Alfred Deakin, speculated about a Monroe Doctrine extended to the Southwest Pacific. That is, an American engagement in the Southwest Pacific that would exclude any outside forces extending their influence in the Southwest Pacific. Another observer has said that Australia's always got an attachment to the dominant maritime power in the world. As it is, in our time as a nation, there have been two. As it happens, they've both been English-speaking, the British Empire and the United States. It was going to be inevitable post-World War II that our relationship with America would be expressed, summarised in terms of a security relationship. I believe the Chinese understand that. I believe, if anything, it's an advantage for us in our dialogue with the Chinese. After all, they're able to see Australia as being a positive influence on the behaviour of the United States in this region. We don't have to choose. Like Singapore, we've got a huge stake in the relationship between America and China, China and America being a good one, a robust one that's got more cooperation in it than competition, accepting realistically there will always be elements of both. But like Singapore, like the other nations of this region, we watch closely the development, the evolution of what is the most important bilateral relationship in the world today. We accept in our foreign policy the centrality of ASEAN. We make this explicit, we return to it again and again. I'm proud in the short time I've been Foreign Minister that on a number of areas we've aligned our foreign policy with that of ASEAN. I think I've said this on a number of occasions. I said it to a Friends of Myanmar meeting at the UN in New York last year. I think that ASEAN was vindicated in taking a forward-leaning approach to Myanmar during the bold political changes that started to develop there. The ASEAN nations were the first to engage with Thein Sein, the first to advise the world that the changes taking place in Myanmar were going to be irreversible. And when I went to Myanmar on my first visit over a year ago, I was able to tell President Thein Sein we were going to lift and not simply suspend our sanctions on the country. And after that, we undertook to lobby European countries on behalf of Myanmar to persuade them to do the same, to lift and not simply leave suspended their sanctions on Myanmar. We took a lead role in the UN in altering the wording of the annual resolution that was carried at the General Assembly touching on Myanmar. It used old language, out-of-date language, that took Myanmar to task and rehearsed and rehashed condemnations that were a decade old. We said to Myanmar, we agree with your perspective. It's language that needs to be updated. So when I go to Myanmar tomorrow, I hope that when I make representations about the Rohingyas, they'll be received as submissions and urgings of a nation that's demonstrated its friendship and support for the democratic transition that this country so boldly has been embarked on. Looking at Asia and looking at this part of Asia, looking at Southeast Asia, there are three things that concern me. One is territorial disputes. The happy narrative out of this region, out of East Asia, is one of economic growth bringing social improvement. All the social indicators in this region have been on a happy upward trajectory. Pick them at random. It's the percentage of girls completing schools, completing university. It's life expectancy. It is all a positive story. It represents a revolution of our time, of which China is, of course, the largest part. But it makes it all the more urgent that this positive trajectory of economic growth and social improvement is not replaced by headlines about territorial disputes, old-fashioned territorial disputes. Like Singapore, like other non-claimant nations, we don't take a side in the territorial disputes in the South China Sea, but we do urge a settlement in accordance with international law. We urge agreement on a code of conduct. And we have offered to play a role, if it's considered useful, in unofficial or half-official exploration of resource-sharing arrangements that would enable the parties in dispute to set aside the arguments over sovereignty and to develop the resource in question and to share the benefits of that resource. We don't preach this, and we're not arriving in the region with a six-point plan, but we stand on the sidelines saying to the claimants, locked in disagreement, if we can help by sponsoring some unofficial or semi-official dialogue towards this end of resource sharing, we're happy to do it. The second troubling development is the ethnic religious tension in the region. I like everyone here, looks to Myanmar for the completion, the fulfillment of a happy narrative, but the treatment of the Rohingyas as a people denied citizenship rights, subjected to harassment and racist attention, is something that can't be tolerated. And it's potentially destabilising for the region. There have been instances of Buddhist violence, militancy, extremism that are deeply troubling. I saw a recent op-ed arguing that this is a matter for ASEAN. Certainly the 10 nations of ASEAN have every reason to be concerned about it. Again, it threatens the overwhelmingly positive narrative out of this region, the positive story out of this region about economic growth and social improvement, with a very different narrative, and that is one about old religious tensions flaming again, even, yes, in this modern world. Territorial disputes and ethnic religious tensions, and finally I'd nominate the danger of the middle income trap. We've all got a trajectory in mind. It was the trajectory completed by Japan over a relatively long time frame, interrupted by the territorial aggrandizement that resulted in the Second World War. But it's a trajectory that's been completed by nations in this region, Singapore in the lead, reaching rich world status. South Korea, stories of Malaysia and Thailand. The danger, however, is that the absence of economic reform, of further market liberalisation, will see countries cheated of rich world status. I'm thinking of the budget subsidies that flow to some industry sectors, cross-subsidies that aren't being pegged back. I'm thinking of the adherence to an old-fashioned model of state-owned enterprises, supported by networks of influence and privilege that prevent the bold moves towards privatisation. I'm thinking of that World Bank report that describes the economic reforms required in China and of the dangers to China, dangers appreciated by the new leadership, if economic reform is not pursued vigorously in China. So, Tim, the dangers of the middle income trap, I think, are unresolved in this region and could compromise what we all hope, I think, is the fulfilment of the promise of reform so far. I should underline, and it's underlined in my printed speech again, the Australian attachment to the centrality of ASEAN. Regional cooperation has become regional integration. Australia is committed to our relationship with ASEAN and committed to ASEAN working as its members want it to work. A very wise, seasoned Australian diplomat said to me on the weekend after I was designated Foreign Minister, he said, we've got to develop the habits of consultation with Asian capitals. And he meant especially the capitals of Southeast Asia, the habits of consultation with Asian capitals that we've developed over the years with traditional or older partners, London and Washington. And I think that's a good summation. It's something we'll never get right every time, but it's not a bad way of summarising Australia's relationship with the dynamic of this most exciting part of the world. Tim, that's a brutal summary of the much wiser speech that'll be circulated and published. It's been a great honour to address this forum, and I really look forward to our questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Minister, thank you very much for your opening comments, in which you summarised many aspects of your speech. Let me try to summarise your summary very quickly. You talked about the changes in Australia's international outlook and the changes in Australia's demography. You talked about the way in which strong regional connections are now acknowledged as being really crucial to the national interest, and the way in which consultations in and with the region are now routine for Australian policymakers. And you talked at the beginning about Australia's very strong and multi-dimensional links with Singapore, and that there are vital economic and security and also people-to-people links. You placed a lot of emphasis on the importance of ASEAN, and you talked about ASEAN's centrality as an institutional focus for cooperation in the region, and also as a focus for wider regional cooperation. But you also talked about what you see as threats to the very positive narrative in the region, of a narrative of socioeconomic improvement and increasing well-being for people in Southeast Asia. You talked about the threats from territorial disputes, you talked about ethnic and religious tensions, and you talked about the dangers of the middle income trap. So you talked in a very wide-ranging way about developments in the region and Australia's interests in Southeast Asia. We now have approximately 30 minutes for questions and answers and discussion. I wonder if I could be mischievous and just start off with one question that occurred to me when you when you were talking about the wider region and Australia's relations with the United States and China, and the way that Australia really doesn't see the need to choose between China and the United States, and wants to be in this enviable position of having very productive and good relations with both of these major powers. I mean, I think that's the ambition of every country in Southeast Asia as well, and certainly Singapore. And it seems to me that's perfectly feasible when things are going well. But I'd be very interested in your perspective of how would Australia behave in the event that relations between China and the United States weren't going so well, if they hit some real problems, if they hit problems perhaps over the South China Sea disputes or perhaps over Taiwan. I mean, after all, Australia is a formal ally of the United States. It is amongst the United States' 2 or 3 closest allies anywhere in the world. We've heard recently that an Australian frigate is now attached to a U.S. carrier battle group in the Western Pacific. I can foresee circumstances in which Australia's close strategic relations with the United States could bring difficulties for Australia's relations with China. How would that be managed?
So you're asking where would we stand in the context of a dispute between the two?
Yes.
If the relationship is not as happy as Singapore, Australia, and every other nation we can think of wants it to be, prays that it will be. That would depend, Tim, on the context, the nature of the disagreement between the US and China. It would depend on that. The ANZUS Treaty is the security relationship between Australia and the United States. It obliges us to consult in respect of an attack made on the forces of one of us in the Pacific. It obliges us to consult. So you're getting into a hypothetical area, and my response is it would depend on the nature of the disagreement, the conflict between the two big powers.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are going to be plenty of questions from the floor, so we'll now open up for discussion. If you'd like to ask a question, could you just please raise your hand, stay where you are. The microphone will come to you, and when you have the microphone, please say who you are and what your institutional affiliation is. Alex Neil.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for that excellent tour d'horizon. It was very informative. I'd like to return to the question of the historical narrative in the region. You referred to 1905 and perhaps 19th century thinking towards territorial disputes in the region. I've just returned from China, where there was a discussion about the legacy of the Cairo Declaration in World War II and what that means for current territorial disputes. But one of my observations is that there is a pervasive sense of containment for China on its periphery. So in your view, how do you think China needs to be reassured, not just in a regional sense, but also perhaps from its perspective of its immediate neighborhood in the Southeast Asian region?
I think there's a book out called China Goes Global by an American scholar called Shambar. And in one of its early chapters, it surveys all the sources of opinion within China on foreign policy. Think tanks, newspapers, commentators, universities. I was a little disturbed as I read his account by the share of the spectrum occupied by people, occupied by the views that might be described as paranoid or insecure or anxious or assertive or over-assertive. That did concern me. I was concerned when I read a report recently that to the Chinese, the Philippines resort to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in respect of its territorial disagreement with China is seen in China as something that the United States would have provoked, organised, planned. I believe that America did not. I believe that, from what I know, the American position on this, that they would have been cautioning restraint, and that there's enough motivation within the Philippines to explain, there's enough in the Philippines' behaviour and perspective and policy to explain their resort to arbitration under that convention. So I'm a bit focused on what we can do to see that, again, using the language of Lee Kuan Yew, the China we deal with is a China educated, that is educated about the rest of the world, knowing the rest of the world. And I think we've all got a challenge in seeing that in the evolution of Chinese attitudes towards the rest of the world, that strand prevails over other strands in their thinking.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. At the back on the left-hand side.
Good evening, Senator. My name is Theophilus. I'm a student, and I have two questions. My first question is, earlier when you spoke, you mentioned the decline of the British Empire in this part of the world during the 1970s. I'd just like to ask you, in the context of that, where does Australia see itself today as a member of the Commonwealth? Second question would be, in the face of perhaps nations such as the UK and Singapore signalling a less welcoming stance towards immigrants, how does a self-consciously multicultural nation like Australia, as you described earlier, relate to that? Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. I've actually found that the Commonwealth provides extremely interesting forums, and it's taken me a bit by surprise. The Commonwealth has just adopted a charter. So that means the 54 or 55 members of the Commonwealth, I think the number depends on who's being suspended at any one time for undemocratic practices. Fiji is in the sin bin for the time being, commit themselves to democratic norms of governance. The Charter is actually a hard-edged document. And I think it means that the Commonwealth of Nations has transmuted itself into a community of democracies. This is a very interesting development. And you've seen Rwanda and Mozambique join the Commonwealth. Rwanda with, I think, a background of Belgium, colonialism. Mozambique out of the Lusophone world, the Portuguese Empire. They've opted to join the Commonwealth, seeing it as a useful community of democracies. At one Commonwealth meeting I had the honour of chairing, there was the Solomon Islands and the Seychelles sitting there, small island states. They told me later that they see the Commonwealth as one forum that gives them, I think about 25 nations of the Commonwealth are small island states. It's a forum, they said, which gives them equality with India, Nigeria. It's a very interesting forum that has become a community of democracies. And I think it's very useful and has a strong African and Caribbean and South Asian flavour. It deserves more study and attention than it's been getting. You asked about attitudes towards immigration. Australia is one of the big immigrant nations. We have a high rate of population growth. It is non-discriminatory. As I said, India and China compete to be our largest source of migrants. There are two arguments that arise. One is a sort of ecological argument that says, for a country like Australia with a continent that's so fragile, a fertile coastal strip, the rest of it desert, semi-arid or desert, there is an issue about how far you want to press population growth. To any Asian audience, this sounds absurd. The idea that Australia is concerned, should be concerned about the environmental sustainability of population growth. And there's not time to go into it now. The second argument about Australia's fairly open approach to immigration is the impact that people smuggling is now having. There's been a huge spike in the numbers coming to Australia waters as a result of the efforts of people smugglers. It represents, if the most recent monthly figures were confirmed and became annualised, we'd be getting about 40% of our migrant intake delivered by people smugglers. This is illegal, it is a racket, it is exploitation, and it's threatening to undermine what is a big humanitarian component in Australia's immigration program. Most of the current people are coming from Iranian, and from Iran. They're Iranian, and our view is that they're not fleeing persecution, but they're economic migrants. And that's why you have a regular migration program. So people smuggling is a threat to Australian immigration, and which I think is one of the world's best migrant policies.
Thank you, Minister. William Chung.
Hi, William from a senior fellow from the IISS as well. Thank you, Senator, for your very informative comments. I have two questions actually for you. Looking through your speech, your prepared speech, you did mention about ASEAN centrality and how the influence of ASEAN on regional infrastructure is enduring. I was a bit surprised that that seems to be rather different, a different assessment from what specialists and observers in this part of the region talk about ASEAN. I remember speaking to an ASEAN official last year, and I would not want to name this person, but he was making a joke about how the general understanding of ASEAN is that it's always in the driver's seat. The problem is that the person in the driver's seat does not exactly know where it's going. And I can give you 3 examples, and I'm sure you can identify it. We saw what happened in Cambodia last year in July, where ASEAN failed to issue a communique for the first time. And we can see that ASEAN franchises, say like the ASEAN Regional Forum, is increasingly becoming irrelevant. We can see what ASEAN is doing with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. A very good FTA on its own merit, but if you compare it to, say, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's a lot to be desired in terms of so-called 21st century FTA components. My second question will relate to China and your use of the phrase happy narrative. I think you used it 2 or 3 times during your speech. I'm afraid I have to disagree with you on that, because maybe I'm Singaporean and I inherited some sense of paranoia from Lee Kuan Yew. But I believe that this pronouncement from Brunei 2 weeks ago about ASEAN working with China on a code of conduct, it's going to take many, many years before we see anything. Mm-hmm. And simply because it really harkens back to the question of China not seeing the dispute to be a dispute, whereby ASEAN claimants like the Philippines and Vietnam, they see it as a dispute. And if you can't agree on the first basis, whether there's a dispute or not, I don't think we're going to get anywhere with a code of conduct. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, my answer to the 2 parts of the question is probably, but I've got a common answer to both questions. That is, if we didn't have one, we'd be looking for one. It's better that we're searching for a code of conduct than to be in a position where one side is not committed. And that's where we seem to be in Phnom Penh last year. So the outcomes from Brunei, which you imply are just a little too tepid for comfort, are most assuredly better than that breakdown in ASEAN, the common ASEAN position that we witnessed distressingly at Phnom Penh in the comparable meeting last year. Our goal is to see that both sides understand the advantage of having a code that governs behaviour while the dispute remains unsettled. The terrifying thing, and the reason I spoke, I listed this as one of the neuralgic points in the otherwise happy narrative out of this region, is that there is too big an opportunity without a binding code of conduct for a commander on the ground, the commander of a vessel, to make a miscalculation. We've got to remind ourselves that the World War I was nearly triggered in 1907 or 1908 by the Tangier incident, a naval incident, misunderstanding, a miscalculation that brought to a head the inherent conflicts that people thought could be held in check. Again, with ASEAN, for all its shortcomings, we wouldn't be so rude to highlight them or to underline them. If it didn't exist, we'd be hoping to invent it. I think after 46 years, it's appropriate for the 10 member nations to take stock as they see fit. But without it, we'd be falling a long way short on so many fronts.
Thank you.
Eliane Coates, S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Thank you for your talk, Senator. You mentioned tonight Myanmar and the Rohingya. Could I just get your opinion on whether you believe ASEAN should be doing more to resolve this crisis, such as facilitating interreligious dialogues, such as we've seen in Aceh, Mindanao? And could you also comment on the spillover effects of this crisis, such as potentially a new wave of asylum seekers, Rohingya asylum seekers, to Australia? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very germane question. We, on the last point first, we don't routinely resettle Rohingyas. We accept the United Nations High Commission on Refugees' view that this has got to be subject to a robust settlement within the country. There's got to be a durable resolution within the country. There are an estimated 800,000 Rohingya in Rakhine State, and the population in Bangladesh, I'm trying to recall, but at least several hundred thousand others, I understand. So they're terrible suffering, and they must be the most discriminated against sizable group in the region. Can't be alleviated by Australia and Canada taking a few thousand more. That's not the answer. The answer is to give them status, give them citizenship, to fix up the appalling economic conditions throughout that province without appearing to favour one ethnic group, because that would only arouse antagonism from others. And to see Australia, I'm proud to say Australia is the biggest donor to Rakhine province, the biggest bilateral donor. We spend money on relieving what are apparently the frightful conditions in the camps in which dispossessed people are forced to live. But it is important that the major political parties in Myanmar find ways of leading majority Burman opinion towards reconciliation with this people. What are the spillover effects? Obviously, one would have to think about asylum seeker numbers throughout the region, and second, attempts by extremist elements to recruit individuals out of this population for jihadist activities. I'm not saying there's evidence of that, but out of desperate refugee camps, people can be persuaded to move to an extremist position. They'd be the potential spillover effects. Yes, I would like to see at least ASEAN discussion towards what assistance could be provided. I must note the evidence of individual ASEAN nations taking a keen and acute interest in this, as they have in Myanmar's democratic evolution, about which they've been so strikingly correct in their assessments.
Thank you. Andy Sprianto from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Minister, you mentioned about people smuggling issue as a big issue in Australia. And following Kevin Rudd's visit to Jakarta recently, in which direction do you think that Indonesia could have done more in cooperation with Australia to address the people smuggling issue? Thank you.
Thank you. We hope to persuade Indonesia, if Indonesia needs persuasion, that the Iranian arrivals in the Republic of Indonesia represent as big a problem for Indonesia as they represent for Australia. Half of the Iranians who arrive in Indonesia, enjoying the advantage of the visa on arrival scheme that's extended to them, end up going to Australia illegally, that is, through people smuggling endeavours. They become irregular. I should use the word irregular. They become irregular migrants. And this is very unsatisfactory to us because we've got a big, generous immigration program with a large humanitarian content. It's the advice we're getting from officials in the front line is that the Iranian migrants are not fleeing persecution, but they're economic migrants. Well, we say that's why we've got a regular migration program to weigh their claims and their advantages to Australia against others. So we would like to maximise cooperation with Indonesia towards a regional solution here. I think it's too early to specify what the content of this could be, but we would underline that it's as big a problem for Indonesia as it is for Australia. The only people benefiting from this are the people smugglers who are running these enterprises. They're leering at us. They're seeking to defy international norms and international laws. They're putting people, cramming people onto unseaworthy vessels. Some of them have got holes cut into the side with a bung in them, ready to be pulled out when they want to stage a sinking, when they know an Australian vessel is within reach or alongside. This is a ruthless business. And we can't private. There are some people in Australia who say, the Green Party and former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, who are saying effectively we should take anyone people smugglers bring into Australian waters. We can't do that. It simply encourages an exponential growth in people smuggling, and it means we are handing over our immigration program, privatising it, contracting it out, if you like, to people running these criminal enterprises. That's the problem we've got, and we will work with Indonesia towards solutions that are compatible with their needs as much as ours. We don't think we can force a solution on our Indonesian partners.
Thanks, Minister. I can see at least two more questions. First of all, Mr. Soria, and then Rohan Gunaratne.
I'm Surinarayan from the Institute of South Asian Studies here in Singapore. So what do you make of this ADMM Plus, the powerful organization of, rather an organization of powerful defense ministers? Do you foresee the possibility of this forum evolving into some kind of a security wing of the East Asia Summit? Otherwise, what are your realistic expectations of this forum, which consists of really some powerful defense ministers, but which doesn't seem to be doing anything much at the moment? Thank you.
I really should take the advice of my colleague, Stephen Smith, Defence Minister, on that. I'm not going to stumble into that territory. If you wouldn't mind me taking that question on notice.
Rohan.
Minister, you understand Asia better than most ministers. It may be because you had a very considerable Asian population to deal with when you were Premier of New South Wales. In many ways, your heart is Asian heart. Is it possible to build, can Australia be a bridge between China and the United States to prevent the making of another Cold War? Can Australia play a more active role in preventing the making of a dispute between these two countries?
I've got a very modest view to that, Rohan. I think the answer is probably no. And when I'm in America, sometimes the Americans who are the greatest flatterers in the world will say, "You're an Australian foreign minister, of course you know far more about us than this, you know about China, you're deeply embedded in the region." And I've got to correct them, and I say very quickly, you Americans have been dealing with China since the Empress of China set sail when the ice in the East River broke up in 1784. The Treaty of Paris had made you independent, and being independent, you could defy the monopoly of the East India Company. And this beautiful vessel set sail when the ice broke down the East River off to China. It probably took 4 months to get to China, but it was laden with fur, and it exchanged in Canton, in the trading settlement, it exchanged fur for the things America wanted to buy from China. Tea and porcelain, preeminently. And took them back and established a burgeoning trade. The Americans were so good at maritime activity, they busted up the monopoly of the East India Company, and they made themselves rich in the process. America's been acquiring an expertise of China since that vessel took leave of New York Harbour in 1784. I think this audience would respect the great reservoir of expertise in American universities when it comes to China. Those scholars who've been working at these problems for a century. And of course the tradition of the sons and daughters of American missionaries embedded in China, becoming scholars, becoming business people. So I would never intrude in my bossy Australian style on Americans and aim to give them advice on this. But I reserve my right to break that vow if I ever see them veering in a bad direction. I think Australia, by the way, can build on its expertise, which is developing strongly, I don't say this in a boastful manner, in our knowledge of Southeast Asia. There was an Australian Vice-Chancellor, the Vice-Chancellor of Sydney University, who'd been at Oxford. He advertised for experts on Southeast Asia. At Oxford, he didn't get a single taker. He arrives at Sydney University, and he's told that the Sydney University already has on its staff, across the disciplines, a total of 203 Southeast Asian specialists, right across the disciplines. And he recently brought this together in a Southeast Asian Studies Centre at Sydney University. I think we've got the potential in Australia, with a bit of modesty, to really clinch our reputation for a specialist knowledge of this world, the wonderful and promising and spectacularly diverse world of Southeast Asia. And would give Americans advice on that, and I think they'd accept quite genuinely that Australia is developing for itself a field for this region.
Thank you, Minister. I think we have time for just 2 more questions. One here in the middle, and one, is that Augustine at the back there?
Minister, my name is Melly Anthony, also from the Rajaratnam School. I want to ask your view about the East Asian Summit, which in 2011, your current Prime Minister has claimed ownership to it. This, according to his words, the realization of the Asia-Pacific community based on the proposal of Australia. Of course, ASEAN countries may differ on that. But my point is, it's been around, and they are, at the moment, rethinking about how best to set the direction of the EES agenda. And you talk about the role of Australia. So how would you like to see the AES moving forward, and what do you think the AES should be taking seriously, given that this is the best forum for all the major powers to come together? Thank you.
I agree with your view that it is the best forum. We're proud of our history with it. We accept the centrality of ASEAN in it, and we've said that. We think it's greatly to the credit of the Obama administration that they've treated it seriously and the President has attended it. We think that's significant, that's a benchmark, and the Obama administration can't be flawed for its attention to this region and accepting the value of the summit. It might be useful for me back in Canberra to commission a bit of work that projects an Australian feel for the future of the institution. Thank you for drawing that to my attention, and we might do some work on it.
Thanks. Final question, Augustine.
Hi, so I'm Augustine. I'm with Channel News Asia. Picking up on your comments about the appalling conditions in the camps in Myanmar and the concerns about the jihadists and all that. But sadly, sir, there's a flip side. There's another side to it. According to my source inside Myanmar, this source described it as, if you take Taliban, there is a concern about the Budliban, the conservative elements within the Buddhist clergy. Now, this is sadly, it's a very serious issue. And of course, the Time magazine issue was banned, and the Myanmar authorities responded by saying it's affecting their ongoing efforts into its national reconciliation. Now, you're off to, that's your next stop, and you're going to have a huge range of conversations. But how much of that is going to weigh in on your aid to the camps and your support that you're giving from Australia? Because this is the other side of the coin, so to speak. The second quick question is, I just had a recent interview with Janana Guzmao, and he very politely and diplomatically touched on the ongoing dispute over the oil fields and the suggestion about the Australian espionage. Can you give us an update on that as well? Thank you.
I'll answer the second part of the question first because it's so easily answered, and that is that you won't find a foreign minister commenting on matters of security and intelligence. Any disagreement with that? Did that astonish any member of the audience? The second one is the very disturbing one. Your first question was the very disturbing one, and that's about condition in the camps. This phenomenon advertised on the cover of Time magazine of a militant Buddhism. I find this deeply, deeply disturbing. It would reflect a hostility of a majority ethnic or religious group directed at a minority. It would appear to be a repudiation of any notion of reconciliation. It would offer no way out. This militancy would offer no way out for this sizable minority within Myanmar that is denied rights and denied citizenship and may even be subject to a two-child policy enforced at the local level, unique of all the 130 ethnic groups in the country, might be subject to a two-child policy. Now, speaking for a country that has established quickly its credentials as a friend of Myanmar, its aspirations, I hope that we can have some leverage in saying leadership is required from the Burman parties, the majority Burman parties, to show that reconciliation is the only path forward in Rakhine province.
Thank you very much. Well, Minister, given what you said earlier, I hope that these questions were robust enough for you. And thank you very much for answering them so frankly and thoughtfully. I'm afraid soon I must bring this evening's lecture to a close, but before doing so, I'd like to thank you very much for making time in your busy program of travel and meetings to speak to us this evening, and also for engaging with our audience at some length. You've spoken about a topic of great importance for your government, and clearly it's one of great relevance for our audience here this evening, but I think that given the importance of relations with Australia for Singapore, and from the point of view of other ASEAN member countries, what you said here this evening will be of real interest more widely in the city-state and more widely within the region of Southeast Asia. Thank you again, Senator Carr, for speaking so eloquently here this evening.